Welcome, 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 online fam. This is Matthew Struck with Why Libertarian, coming to you with another live session here. So today, we're continuing to talk as a country politically about a bunch of stuff that some of it matters and some of it really doesn't matter. We're talking about controversy associated with the former vice president's son and what happened over in Ukraine. We're talking about still the third day of confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett. And we continue to talk about some of the other ridiculous things that are associated with the current presidential campaign season, which, by the way, we are 20 days out from November 3rd. So I'm thinking we haven't seen anything yet, and nor do I think we will truly know who the president is on November 3rd, unfortunately. But the reason why I'm coming to you live right now has to do with something that came up with in a conversation that I had with Joe Evans, who's based out of the 1st Congressional District up there in Idaho. Joe and I did a live segment two days ago. I just put up the full interview on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't checked that out, definitely check it out. But the biggest issue that we talked about, or one of the big issues, had to do with spending. Okay, this was a mainstay of classic libertarian, planks that got a lot of publicity, specifically when Ron Paul was running. And what's funny is all of a sudden everyone just kind of forgot about it. Occasionally you hear someone talk about it, but really, the point of this live is this is literally the biggest existential threat to our country right now. You can put all of the other crap aside, all of the other tabloid type stories about candidates, all of the other, they're important conversations to have, but the social issues that we're talking about, none of that matters if the financial strength and the financial security of the country essentially falls apart, right? Like, no one is talking about social issues in a country that's impoverished. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is really just the visualization of numbers. Okay. And it seems really dry, but truthfully, at the end of the day, one of my big contentions here is that average folks, actually most folks, just can't even conceptualize of the type of numbers that are being thrown around. Right now you have, Pelosi and Mnuchin and Trump talking about 1.2 billion, 1.6 billion, 2.2 billion, like it's nothing, like it's a couple extra poker chips being thrown into the middle of the table. Those are real numbers. They're not fake made up numbers, and they have some absolutely incredible impacts on this country if those checks get written and if that money ends up getting borrowed or printed and spent. Just recently, our national debt ended up surpassing $27 trillion. Okay. Part of the reason why I'm talking about visualization is because the concept of a trillion is not something that most of us really can even wrap our heads around. Okay. So, at the beginning here, I just want to kind of do some of these. You might have heard of them before, but some of these are some like visualization exercises where you can close your eyes and kind of think of, how it would even be possible to understand what a trillion is. All right. A million seconds, 1 million seconds, all right, is about 11 and a half days. 11 and a half days. So almost 2 weeks. A billion seconds is 32 days, over a month. 1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years. 32,000 years. And that's 1 trillion seconds. If you equate every single one of those seconds to $1 that's in the national debt right now, that equates to 864,000 years, right? Even that number is hard to conceptualize, all right? So now let's think of something a little bit more physical. $100 bills, if you stack them 10 feet high, covers an NFL football field, all right? That's $1 trillion. 10 feet high, covering a professional NFL football field, that's $1 trillion. 27 football fields 10 feet high is currently the national debt. All right. Again, almost impossible. If you need some help, some visual cues, go to YouTube. There's a ton of these videos talking about how to visualize just these insane numbers. If you had $1, okay, equaling a mile, right? If $1 got you 1 mile worth of travel, we could go from Earth to Uranus. All right. Now, Neptune is technically not a planet anymore. I don't know if all of you knew that, but so I picked the furthest out known, and I'm going to use air quotes, planet in our solar system is Uranus. We could go there and back, round trip, 312 and a half times, and that's just 1 trillion miles. If we were to travel 27 trillion miles, that would be 8,437 round trips from Earth to Uranus and back. Okay. So that just kind of makes you understand just the ridiculous magnitude of the numbers that we're talking about. All right. So as I referenced, $27 trillion in federal debt. I'm not even talking about the unfunded liabilities, which are even more catastrophic than that. And we can have discussion later on about whether or not that should be included in that number. But so now let's think about it in terms of how much your share is. You as an individual American, 330 million people in this country. That's men, women, and children. Each one of those people, men, women, and children, your share is $81,874. If you make 30, 40, 50 grand a year, you've had basically elected officials borrow more money against your name and your wife or your partner's name or your best friend's name and each one of your children's names, more money than you make in a year if you make under $81,874. But now that's interesting because most of those people in the country, or not all of them, are in the labor force. So let's look at per taxpayer. Everyone who pays $1 in tax on average every single year, as taxpayers who work, earn money, $216,772 apiece. That means of all of the taxpayers in this entire country, each one of us would have to pony up over 200 G's to pay our end of the debt that's been run up on our behalf. Now, let's put that in perspective of the average American worker. The average American worker makes $44,000 a year, $44,720 was the last estimate that I saw from Business Insider. That basically means that if you are working, making the average income in America, you would have to work for almost 5 full years to pay off your portion of the debt, to pay off that $216,000. Now, let's also look at it in terms of the fact that that's just the federal debt. We've also got state and local governments that borrow money. That's an additional $4 trillion, $4 trillion that gets thrown on top. So guess what? Your prize for this part of the game is you get another $25,000 if you're a tax-paying citizen. And that basically adds another 3/4 of a year. So almost 6 years of your life, if you make the average amount of money every single year, you would have to give every single dollar of your gross pay to the government to pay off your portion of the debt that they have rung up on your behalf. I don't know if you ever signed a promissory note. I don't know if you ever thought that you went through an underwriting or a credit check for that amount of money, but that's what you owe. That's what your wife or your partner or your best friend owes. That's what your kids owe. And if we don't pay it back and it's bigger, that's what your grandkids owe and your great grandkids. So just think about it that way. Now, let's also look kind of like, all right, well, that's where we are. Where have we come from? So Trump, first year in office, 2016, or just before he took office, 2016. The federal debt was $20 trillion. That means over a 4-year period, that's a 35% rise. Okay. State and local government debt was $3 trillion. That's a 33% rise over 4 years. That basically means that the debt, if that stays on course, the debt doubles every 3 years. Actually, probably even less than 3 years because it compounds. All right. That's freaking scary, dude. You already owe 216 grand. How would you like to owe $432,000 in 3 years? Okay. Everyone makes fun of countries that ended up in hyperinflation like Zimbabwe. Well, guess what? We're at that cliff, man. We're at that cliff. We're getting to that point. Now let's look at 2008. Obama, first year in office, or just before Obama's first year in office, $10.7 trillion national debt. All right. It's a 160% increase over 12 years. 2.5 trillion in state and local debt. They actually did a better job, and it still sucks. They're up 60% over 12 years. Okay. This kind of calls into attention. Now, look, first of all, I'm not one of those people that doesn't understand the fact that the president does not cut the budget. Okay. The president makes recommendations as far as the budget goes. This is on the legislature. This is most definitely on the legislature. It's on every single one of the Democrats who basically spends blindly, spends drunkenly with other people's money. It's on every single Republican who has failed to fight back every single year. And wouldn't you understand that every single year there's bipartisan support for the increase in the debt ceiling? There's bipartisan support for the passing of the national budget. And every single year we overspend what we take in revenue. And the promises of, being able to be a little bit more sane with our money have yet to come to fruition anytime within, at least the last 20 years. All right. So now let's think of also this way. A lot of the Democrats' rallying cry is, well, the rich don't pay enough money. They don't pay their fair share, right? So that 216,000 that's taken out in my name and your name and everyone else's name in this country, that 216,000 shouldn't look like 216. The 216 that's owed by Bill Gates should more look like, 10 times that, 1,000 times that, 10,000 times that number. Well, guess what? I pulled a couple of numbers that estimate, and again, these are purely estimates, but what's the total net worth of the 1% of the wealthiest households in the United States? Well, somewhere in between, and this is like ping-ponging or backing into a number from Brookings Institute that looked at it in 2016 and then kind of projecting out the growth, and the Survey of Consumer Finances by the Federal Reserve. Basically, 19 to 40 trillion is the estimate. So the top 1% of the wealthiest households in the United States own between 19 and 40 trillion dollars. That basically means if you take the average, we're right about 30. You would have to confiscate almost every single dollar of net worth of that wealthiest 1% in the United States, take it all to pay down the debt. So, yeah, they're rich, but apparently they're not nearly as rich as the speed at which our elected officials can spend money. And by the way, it's money that doesn't exist. It's money that's given to us by other countries or IOUs that we throw out there. And yeah, a lot of it's owned by American citizens. But guess what? If you try and collect on it all at once, it ain't there. It's fictitious. So now let's also look at the monetary base. The monetary base started in 2008, and this is more to the point of inflation, right? We've been talking about spending overruns, but let's look at monetary base. 2008, we had roughly an M1, meaning the cash in circulation of about $1.48 trillion. That balloons in 2016, just 8 years later, to $3.89 trillion. And then we finally land in 2020 with a $4.9 trillion estimate of M1. If you look at M2, M2 is even much higher because it includes short-term notes. It includes some investment dollars that can easily be drawn upon for purchases. So why does this matter? Why do we, deficit spending is obviously something Americans understand. If you have too much debt, you have too much credit card debt, you're underwater in your mortgage, you get that. You understand how dangerous that is. Well, that's only one piece of the puzzle here. That debt is also part of the biggest wealth transfer in the history of the world. It's basically money that's borrowed off of our backs, but then given in subsidies to industries and large companies, which are owned mostly by, 1% or 10% of the wealthiest Americans. And it's done by our elected officials. So we're complicit. We've allowed them to do it without calling them on their BS. But so let's look at inflation. Inflation kind of does the same exact thing, but it's even stealthier. As much as you don't feel the national debt, inflation is something that you don't feel, or you feel and you chalk it up to something else, or you don't understand why you feel it. All right. Inflation causes poverty. The more money in circulation, the more money there is to go after the goods and services that are required to just exist, to live. So when you increase the money base, it basically erodes the purchasing power of the poor and the middle class. Each individual dollar can buy each one of those poor people and each one of those middle class families less than it could the day before. So milk gets expensive, eggs get more expensive, gasoline gets more expensive. And guess what? If you're wealthy, you probably buy about as much of those things as poor and middle class people do. That's why inflation does not affect the wealthy class as much. Okay. Now, this isn't a call to pull money away from the wealthy or redistribute it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is to explain to you why inflationary monetary policy and what the Federal Reserve has put on us on a course for has basically caused poverty. It's killed people because it means they haven't had enough means in order to be able to provide for themselves or their family. And it's caused middle class families to slip into poverty. Now, like I said, the poor and the middle class, they spend most of the dollars they get. Most of that money that they bring in every single month, whether it's, federal money that comes in the form of welfare or WIC or some other support program, or if it's a middle class family that's dependent on one or two middle class incomes that they make every single month, the majority of that money gets spent. It gets spent on staples and things that they need every single month to survive. Well, truthfully, the only way to overcome inflation long term is to have invested assets that rise at higher to or at least the level of inflation. That's the only way to overcome that. So who has that? Well, it's basically the upper end of the wealthiest households in the United States that have the means to be able to invest enough money to overcome the erosion of their purchasing power by inflation. Now, like I said, that siphons money away from the poor and the middle class. It does it by reducing the amount that they can purchase. And oh, by the way, where are they purchasing most of those goods and services from? Well, some of them are purchasing them from, middle class organizations or middle class families that own and operate businesses. Some of them are buying, from entrepreneurs that might be poor or middle class and trying to better themselves. But a lot of that money goes to the upper end of the corporate scale. It goes to the Walmarts, it goes to the Targets, it goes to the Amazons. COVID-19 is a perfect example of how this dynamic works. You've had a situation where big box retailers and online retailers like Amazon have benefited from this, much to the detriment of mom and pops. And so not only were they behind the eight ball before, but now they're even worse off. And those big box retailers, the big companies that are essentially the go-to now for the staples of life that get delivered to your front door, they're benefiting hand over fist. And it's not just because they're gobbling up market share. It's not just because they have a government-aided monopoly now on business. It's because also the amount of money that's being printed means that they can drive up the price of their goods, and you have no other recourse. You have to pay it. And that benefits those folks that can offset the decrease in their purchasing power by owning things like stock, like real estate, like hard assets that appreciate in price when the number of dollars increases. So now let's look at a couple of the downstream effects of this. Why is it that Democrats thought up the idea of a minimum wage in the first place? It's to offset the effects of inflation. Okay. And just a perfect example is something that Ron Paul would mention time after time. And I still don't understand how this doesn't stick with most people. Back in 1960, the minimum wage was $1.25. That $1.25 would have been paid in 5 quarters that had silver in them. You actually had money that had precious metals in them. Those 5 quarters today, if that person was still getting paid $1.25, but those quarters contain the same amount of silver, would be making $20 an hour. And y'all are squabbling over $15 an hour for fast food jobs. Now, why is that? Why could $1.25 in 1960 buy you the same amount of stuff as $20 would today? And it's because of inflation. It's completely because of inflation. It's because of the Federal Reserve and because they basically run unchecked. They are essentially a controller of the monetary supply, and they do it outside of the checks and balances of the standard U.S. government. All right. Now, this is also why folks become so pro-union. Unions are not a bad thing when you have other things that are happening around it that are positive. When there's growth, when there's not hyperinflation or artificially generated inflation, unions are a check. Okay. They are a check. The problem is that you now become so pro-union that you pledge allegiance to the union, even when they're negotiating for things that aren't in your best interest. And the problem with that is if you have a situation where you have inflation, The union has no recourse but to negotiate harder and harder and harder to try and get more and more money for its members, at least members that retain their jobs after the new collective bargaining contract kicks in at the higher rates. But that being said, they're doing it defensively, and in some cases, like you've seen some of the casino collective bargaining negotiations in Atlantic City, New Jersey, end up in the businesses just choosing to close up shop. They can't offset the demands of the union in order to make up for the stagger. And so unless you have an ultra competitive, quickly growing business, the union has no recourse but to negotiate for as much money as possible for its members. And you have no recourse because you can't make up the stagger. You can't make up the stagger of inflation. You can't make up the stagger of basically deficit spending and higher taxes every single year in order to maintain that level of debt. Now, what else does deficit spending and inflation cause in our country? It fuels unrest and it causes really bad policy decisions. Racial inequality and the police state are a direct result of sending more money than we have collectively and eroding the value of our cash. If more people were middle class, they would have less inclination to be violent or to be criminals and commit crimes. Part of the police state within this country, police serve a valuable resource if they're not acting as, an arm of the state, and in many cases unknowingly, but acting as an arm of the state to keep masses in check. And in some areas, not all, but in some areas, you see that. You see the police as basically a force that keeps the masses at bay, and that shouldn't be their job. They're thrown into harm's way, and it's not necessarily because they chose to do it or because they had any hand in creating that environment. They were thrown into that situation because of really crappy decision making and crappy policy and crappy monetary policy. Now, it's also why the poorest among us are in favor of wealth redistribution. Why does Occupy Wall Street happen? Well, it happens, one, because of corruption on Wall Street, which, by the way, is it's no secret. It's no best kept secret. But two, it happens because monetary policy basically creates a wealthy class that can overcome these impediments for other folks to better themselves and better their lives. It also stalls the upward mobility of the poor and the middle class. In fact, it does it so well that it actually pulls some of the middle class back down into poverty. And most folks don't see any recourse. Poorly designed redistribution programs like welfare lock people into poverty. And it contributes to essentially the erosion of the middle class, which we've seen falling over the last few decades. The final thing is that inflation and debt fuels the need for a standing military, which was never the intent of the framers of the Constitution. And they're deployed throughout the whole world indefinitely. And why is that? It's because they have to be there in case a country decides to not take our dollars or to compete with us in a manner such that we can't make up for their competitive advantage by borrowing and printing money. And it makes us less safe in most ways because it creates more enemies every single day that we're perceived as an occupying force in a sovereign nation. So what's the solution? The solution is that on all levels, federal, state, and local, we need a third voice. We need a third voice that stands for sound money, and we need a third voice that stands for not overspending what we take in taxes. And in most cases, it actually stands for cutting taxes and cutting spending so that we can get to a better place where we actually have growth again. We don't have manufactured paper growth in the form of inflation. And that's the last thing I'm going to leave you with is the inflation is there to make things look better than they really are, right? Part of the reason why Wall Street is doing so well right now and Main Street is hurting is because of inflation. It's because of fiat currency, and it's because of borrowing and spending and the printing of money. And now if I can get this to work, hopefully it does not act up on me, I can share with you basically the thing that you should check every single day to remember just where your place is in this country and how you're thought of by the politicians that overspend on your behalf. This is the national debt clock. There's an app that you can also download on your phone. I believe you have to pay $2 for it. I don't receive any kind of remuneration from them. This is not a paid endorsement, but this is something that I check regularly. There's a lot of numbers here, but I'll tell you what, the big ones that I look at are pretty much that one in the top left, the U.S. national debt. And then there's a couple other ones, state and local debt on the right-hand side. And then if you want to really be self-punishing, you can look at basically the total amount of U.S. Indebtedness based off of unfunded liabilities that we currently have, namely Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. But we can talk about that another time. I appreciate the time that you spent with me now. Again, we're going to be doing a lot more of these. If you haven't checked out the interview with Joe Evans on the YouTube channel, please do so. If you watch this live, or if you watch this in recording afterward, please like, share, retweet, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and we'll have more coming at you. Thanks.